Hey, Andy.
Hey Jed, how are you?
Good. You always beat me on the tacky Christmas sweaters, but it seems like you might be like doing tacky sweaters all year long now.
Dude, tacky. This is just an old fisherman sweater. These things are classic.
Well, I'm going hoodie on you.
The classics never go out of style, Jed.
Well, all right, I like it. I mean, and knowing that you're fishing in it, I guess I'll give it
And
a
it's
crack.
freezing cold here. It's actually really legit sweater weather in Virginia.
I'm glad that we're starting off the new year and maybe we'll be disciplined about it. We'll remind everybody, hey, this is Wonky Folk. This is Jed Wallace and Andy Rotherham. We've had been doing this now for a few years. If you guys can hit likes and if you can hit subscribes, that's all great stuff. We really appreciate it. Meanwhile, we're delighted to have a great guest to get things started. Andy, you've actually known Parker longer than me. You want to start with the intro here?
Yeah, look, I mean, Parker's one of my favorite. So they're bias fully on display. Parker's one of my favorite people in the sector. He's smart, he's fearless, he does creative work, and he's just an absolutely wonderful human. I've been doing a thing the last few years that allows me just to spend some informal time with him fishing out in Colorado, which is where he is based. And he'll talk more about the different work he does. He runs a really fascinating fellowship that I'd urge you, if you are a Colorado person who is either into ed policy or leading that way, that you would look at. He's based in Denver, but it's the University of Colorado, but they're based in Denver. And he can tell you more about all of that. But just a fantastic longtime person. I don't even know. I'm trying to remember, Parker. You're one of those people I can't remember actually when we just literally first met. But he's someone, if I'm out in Colorado with teams, I try to get him to come by and sit with them for a little bit so they can learn from him. Just a fantastic person.
Well,
so expect lots of hard hitting questions.
Hi, thanks for having me. Great to see you.
Look, I don't know how it is that you and I haven't crossed paths earlier. I've been quoting your stuff for a very long time. I'm from Colorado. You've been sending me decks. I'm already sending them to my parents, to share with all of their old retired education folk about just the progress that's been made in Denver. But thanks for joining us. And for our guests that may know less about you, how do you talk about your experience in the ed reform world? You're in Denver now, but I was intrigued to learn about all sorts of things that you had done earlier in your career. So can you just set a little context for our folks about, what you've done previously and how it's put you, in this position to make the unique contribution you're making right now?
Sure. I guess in some ways my career is sort of followed the trajectory of ed reform a little bit, in the sense that I was in college when charter school.
I'm sorry to hear that, Parker. I thought you were doing better than that.
No, I was in college when charters were first created, and in Colorado, I went to Colorado College, and so I sort of had a firsthand view of the beginning of that work in Colorado. And even as a college student, I was just fascinated by frankly the debate over whether there was some other way to provide public education than the traditional system. And so I actually then joined Teach for America. I was one of the early years of Teach for America, and actually taught in New Orleans before Hurricane Katrina at a high school called Booker T. Washington. And to be frank, I was a witness to a crime. It was an ongoing denial of the American dream. I fully admit I'm, privileged white boy in a lot of ways, sort of had a white savior complex, and yet that was really the most humbling experience of my life, but also just really fundamentally shattered my naivete about the American dream and about the reality of equal opportunity in America. And so I actually went to law school then because I wanted to sue New Orleans public schools for special ed violations. But also knew I didn't want to be a lawyer forever, so I got a master's in public administration. I worked on Capitol Hill for a year for the late Senator Ted Kennedy on the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. And that was right when there was an effort to reauthorize No Child Left Behind. And this is actually the early years, or at least I think for me, when I first started reading Edu-Wonk and couldn't stop. Couldn't like I was.
Now we know why it all. Now we know why it all went sideways.
Yeah, no, you're. Yeah,
you're such a promising young man.
Yeah, it's no joke that a lot of what you wrote at the time really, resonated with me as someone who, here I was, probably Senator Kennedy had never hired a Teach for America person, right? That in itself was controversial. The fact that I was at that point already really interested in public school choice, chartering as as a what I view as a progressive way to think about reinventing public education. And so it sounds crazy, but I got lucky because I moved out to Colorado with my wife, but we didn't have jobs. And somehow I got lucky enough to be connected to Michael Bennett, who was then the superintendent of Denver Public Schools. And I got hired to be in charge of what was then only a small number of charter schools. When I first started in Denver in 2008, there were about 17 charter schools. And by the time I left 3 years later, there were almost 50. And today there still are almost 50 charter schools in the city. So that whole experience of sort of teaching in a really dysfunctional environment where it was just obvious that the system had not been designed for my success as a teacher or for my students' success. And then I was really inspired by, frankly, inspired by what Denver was proposing to do. When I arrived, they had just launched this whole strategy to fundamentally reinvent the school district. So that's kind of where I started, and I've been obsessed ever since.
With many stops along the way, including working at NACSA, which I was not remembering before you mentioned it when we last spoke. Also, now you're at the University of Colorado, Denver, and it's an amazing perch from which to look at the Denver experience now.
And you're doing just some amazing work out there. Why don't we just dive into that? I think there's probably some contextual questions, but you've done sort of 2 landmark studies on student achievement in Denver as part of these reforms. And it's interesting that, you talked about getting to know Michael Bennett, and he was, then he became the superintendent, then he was appointed to the Senate, and now he's running for governor and is in a contested primary for governor. And I think that's some of that when we get to the politics is sort of a backdrop for this, but he put in place a number of changes. And then you went and you've looked at them now twice in 2 different ways. So why don't you talk about that, like both those studies and your work?
Sure. So, I guess I think I should say that when I sort of first started learning about charter schools, I was very sympathetic to the concerns of those who were worried that they would simply provide an escape hatch from the existing system and not engage in kind of how to reinvent it. And so part of my interest in Denver really does come from what I believe is real unique about Denver, in that rather than just sort of pursuing these various reform strategies, charter schools were one of them, but there was also a pay for performance program for teachers, autonomy for district level schools, etc. These different reform activities were tried in different places, have been tried in different places. But what I think is different about Denver is that, like the model, the portfolio strategy from Paul Hill and his colleagues, just like that strategy is intended to provide an alternative model for providing public education at scale. I think Denver's effort is a very explicit and from the very beginning was a very explicit attempt not just to improve the existing system, but to fundamentally transform it to the point of replacing it with an alternative paradigm oriented around different operating assumptions, namely choice for families, empowerment for schools, and accountability for outcomes. So for me, like I've been working, I spent most of my career as a practitioner, right? I did work for NACSA, but I also, I work primarily in authorizing and am fascinated by sort of the regulation of new public delivery systems. And how can we find ways to fulfill the public and private purposes of government in ways that are adaptable to current realities and that ultimately can be hopefully more effective and equitable. And so for me, the fundamental question about the Denver reforms, and part of what fascinates me so much, is that I really do think they call the question of whether it is possible to provide public education through some mechanism other than the traditional unified school system. And so I also have always been a politics junkie. And so I really, especially after leaving DPS, and then I've worked, in education all over the country in almost every state as a result of my work with NACSA, and I ended up working in Louisiana for the State Department of Education there, and I've seen all these different educational contexts, and it was just fascinating to look back on Denver, because I've been tracking Denver since I left there in a pretty obsessive way, and it was just sort of it was frankly mind-blowing to me that Denver could be having the conflict that it was having circa 2015, at the beginning of sort of the conflict nationally, but also in Denver. It was just mind-blowing to me that conflict could occur without a recognition of the vast array of different ways that these kinds of reforms are actually taking place across the country. And so I had witnessed places where there were real inequities around things like special education or equitable access during enrollment and things like that. And yet here Denver was, and I think, I hope we'll talk some about the various ways that Denver actually is explicitly designed to address the very real challenges that autonomous schools present for the provision of public education at scale. And so what I mean by that is that, there are real fundamental features across Denver's reform strategy that acknowledge that the introduction of these autonomous independent operators into what is intended to be a centralized system can create externalities, and economists talk, but negative consequences for the broader system, and that especially as those schools grow, get to scale, it becomes all the more important to be attentive to those challenges. And so, yeah, I think Denver. I think then the last thing is just that it was just fascinating that how little the conflict over the reforms in Denver was focused on the actual outcomes that the reforms had produced. And so for me, and that ultimately is probably the thing, I really want to give a shout out to Paul Teskey, who was for many years the dean of the School of Public Affairs here at CU, but is also one of the pioneers of school choice research, and was in the 90s writing about parents and their preferences for schools, and most importantly for me, frankly, the obstacles that those parents, particularly low-income parents, face in accessing those choices. And so I met Paul very early on when I first started working for Denver, because I was reading his work and realizing how much it spoke to what we were trying to do in the district. And so he and I have had a great relationship, but and I really am grateful that he's given me this opportunity, because part of what I remember, I mean, we were both sort of looking at each other like, what is going on here? Like, these reforms are demonstrably effective, and we didn't even have the kind of rigorous empirical evidence that we have now then, but there was lots of descriptive evidence that the reforms in Denver were successful. I mean, just the fact that the district went from the bottom 5th percentile of all districts in the state in 2007, a 39% four-year graduation rate, all the way up to above the 60th percentile of districts in the state, performing near the state average, even with a much more disadvantaged population. And so we both of us wanted to dig in and really try to understand as much as we could about what happened in Denver and what it might show us about the future of reform.
Parker, on several occasions at Charterfolk, I've cited your research, and I usually find a slide or two that uses the term historic. You use historic progress or something like that. Now, that might be historic as it's relative to Denver over a long period of time, but I also think the use historic is relative to what's happened across the entire country. When you're using terms like that, can you just put a little more color on it? Why did you use that terminology? Why is Denver's progress historic, in your opinion?
Yeah, so first of all, I think Denver is really one of the first districts in U.S. history to willingly, voluntarily give up its authority to operate all public schools within its jurisdiction, and without giving up its authority to govern public education. And for me, that's a massively important shift, because as many of us are well aware, I mean, historically, the unitary school district model, the direct connection between governance and operation is one of the core features of public education in the United States, and so I think it is really important to recognize how rare and even radical it was for Denver to say, hey, this traditional model, it's fundamentally broken, and it's not working and unlikely and is unlikely to work for the students we have here in Denver, and we need to be willing to fundamentally change the model. And so I do think the reforms are historic in that sense. There's another interesting just aspect I have to just note, because I am a real history junkie. But part of why I'm still so obsessed with Denver is because when I first got into academia about 8 years ago now and really started, digging into this, I discovered that for lots of different reasons, Denver actually was a model school system at the turn of the 20th century. And it was actually viewed by educators all over the country as this example of what was called the modern school system. And so it's been fascinating for me to dig back into that history and to realize sort of the connection between the historical realities that led to the creation of very large school systems in the beginning of public education in the United States, even as we had over 100,000 one-room schoolhouses in cities due to mass immigration, industrialization. These systems became massive almost overnight. And so, for example, Denver went from 150 students in 1875 to 30,000 in 1910. 30,000 students in 1910. Yeah. And so what part of what is so fascinating to me about that is that the modern school system, from a structural point of view, was designed to address that rapid, massive growth and to figure out a way to do it at scale. Today it just blows my mind that we continue to essentially operate that way, more or less all over the country. And so that in itself, I think, is just interesting, is how much Denver, by the way, was the first city also, and perhaps not coincidentally, to have a single salary schedule for teachers. Mm-hmm. It was the teachers union in Denver had the first contract west of the Mississippi. And so Denver has, since its very beginning, been this sort of site where it could, on the one hand, be a model, for others, but also has gone through like the exact challenges that I think are sort of representative of the entire sort of struggle of public education in the United States. Similarly, Colorado itself is an interesting place where we have 178 school districts, but 100 of them have less than 2,000 students. So it's this dynamic of how do we operate education, public education at scale, I think is a really fascinating question and an important one for the future of education in the United States. But that's part of, again, what drew me to Denver and is keeping me obsessed.
So before we get to the some of the analysis, which we will get to, people are listening are probably like, I thought we were gonna, like, real quickly, you mentioned a moment ago there's some famous pieces of Denver. Let's talk about those. And then also, I think for people who may not be familiar with Colorado, if you could just real quickly, just universal public school choice, open enrollment in Colorado. So there's some features there that are not, that you don't find everywhere.
Yeah, so I think it is important to know that Colorado has had public school choice through mandatory open enrollment within districts and across districts lines since 1994. So for over 30 years, parents in Colorado have a legal right to enroll in any school in their school district and any school across district lines, so long as there's capacity. There's some restrictions around that, but that's a very important feature because and then Colorado also was the third state to adopt a charter school law, and in 1994, around the same time that open enrollment. And so I think one of the interesting things and essential to understand about the beginning of Denver's reforms and sort of the rationale for them is that they were launched in response to the disruption that had been created by open enrollment and the introduction of charter schools. And so
and also, wasn't there was pressure still out there for private school choice as well? There was a referendum, and so
yes,
yeah.
there were certainly have always been some people in Colorado who really have been dedicated to private school choice. But I think even more remarkable for me is that there has just been this long-lasting bipartisan support for open enrollment and choice in education in general. And so I think that's just an important thing to remember, because when we first started looking at how to improve the functioning of school choice within Denver public schools, one of the things that we realized was that 45% of the district was choosing a school other than their school of assignment. And this was in 2008, 2009. And that in itself is remarkable. And it was this, I still remember this because it was a real sort of awakening moment for the leadership of the district at the time, because they realized that this reality was already here, and yet they were not managing it in any way. And I think it's true. I was there because I think that actually was a real problem for the leadership of the district, because they viewed that not just as a threat to the district from a financial point of view, but as a real threat to equitable access and equitable provision. And so from their point of view, just letting this thing happen around them and sort of not trying to actually lead it was, from their point of view, causing the district harm, and actually was going to prevent it from ever being able to actually take control of its own destiny. So I do think that dynamic, another dynamic that's just important to recognize, is that Colorado is really one of the few states in the country that is really a local control state, in the sense that there are about 6 of the 50 states that have some provision in their constitution that references local control. Colorado is one of those states. Nonetheless, Colorado also has a relatively unified governance structure, and in that there are 178 approximately districts, but the State Board of Education is directly responsible for oversight of the state. And so this is, again, I think, a tension that we see still today playing out all across the country is education actually a state function, or is it a local function? And to what extent should we try to balance those things? And so, again, these are all the kinds of things that that are fascinating to me on an intellectual level. And so then the point there is that the state board does have the authority to intervene in districts. They could shut down a district entirely or whatever. And so, interestingly, Denver sued the state back in the late 90s to block charter schools because they claimed that they were a violation of local control. And the Colorado Supreme Court denied that claim on the grounds that the state still maintains the authority to intervene in cases where they think it's necessary to promote equity of access or opportunity or performance, or any of those fundamental public purposes. And so I think it is really important to recognize, when I was first hired in DPS, the district had, for the first time at the time, just tried to close an extremely low performing charter school and was overturned by the state. And I remember Michael Bennett telling me, we're never going to let that happen again. And that's your job, Parker. And part of that is, what he meant was, we need to actually own this in a way that we can demonstrate to the state board that this school should not be receiving public funds because it's not fulfilling its public responsibilities, and it has nothing to do whether it's a charter school or district school or anything else. And the only way to do that was from Michael Bennett's and Tom Boasberg's eventually point of view, was to actually become the best charter authorizer we could possibly become. And so it's no joke that a lot of the work in Denver around trying to become a strong charter school authorizer was to ensure that the district actually maintained its authority to govern public education in the city.
Well, Parker, I mean, the use of the term historic that I was referring to, yes, there are historic things about the unprecedented nature of the reforms, especially in the continuum of public education across the United States. But there's also just the historic progress. There's not that much reason to pay any attention to Denver if they've made all these changes and it hasn't done anything. But your research shows, in two very compelling bites at the apple, that what's happened in Denver is unprecedented in terms of growth, of improvement, of equity and excellence, and the job's not done. But it's in an environment where Denver itself is not even aware of this. And I know, Andy, you wanted to talk about, just the publicity and communications, what was going on related to Denver. For whatever reason, school board elections start happening in 2015 or 17 and sending things in the opposite direction, but seemingly without even being aware of the fact that Denver is one of the national success stories. How do you grok that? And Andy, if there's something different around the messaging and communications.
No, before we get to that, though, we still haven't just gotten to, I think, Parker, you should, you did two studies. Yeah. I'll briefly summarize them, and then you should fill in some details just briefly, and then we can, I think Jed's question is important. One was looking at data across the district, and you found gains, but it wasn't student level data. You then spent several years trying to get student level data against a fair amount of resistance, and we could talk about that's a weird thing. That people were so reluctant to want you to have data to be able to do a good, even better analysis. You then did a second one that had student level data and found very significant effects. And I guess I disagree with Jed a little bit in the sense of all this work in Denver. If the results hadn't found anything interesting, I do think that would be important. That would be like, we'd want to know why and so forth. Because it was such an ambitious set of reforms. But in fact, you found the opposite. You found really substantial, Jed's used the word historic level gains for a school reform project. So what am I missing in the story there? Fill in color.
So thank you for bringing me back to the present, because I really do love the historical. But I do. So just briefly to explain, we set out, when we first started this research, to answer the question of whether Denver's reforms improved educational performance citywide, district-wide. And I should note that in itself is relatively difficult to do almost everywhere else other than Denver. And there are reasons for that we can talk about if we want, but Denver's unified structure in which all of these different schools are operating. So there are 200 total public schools in Denver. 50 of them are charter schools and 50 of them are innovation schools. And the question is, does this actually result in better educational outcomes? And especially, does it result in better educational outcomes for the students who the district has historically failed to serve? And so, through a series of 2 different studies, we have examined this question, this basic question: did the reforms work, in the sense that did they actually improve outcomes? And so what we find is, on average, these reforms resulted in large academic gains in both subject areas for the average Denver student across almost every subgroup, and over multiple years of reform. And so we look at 40,000 total students. 20,000 of them are part of the Denver reforms, and 20,000 of them are comparison students in surrounding districts who've been matched on their demographics. And so what we want to know is, did a student, the average student, benefit by going to Denver public schools instead of one of the surrounding districts? And so part of what is so historic is that it is, educational improvement is rare. It is rare to find strong educational improvement in education research in itself, right? Most interventions actually don't have an effect, and are either negative or null. But part of what is remarkable is that not only are the results we find consistently positive, but they are among the largest ever observed in education research. In terms of their duration, their scale, and their actual size. And so we see that the average Denver student who experienced the reforms, and it's important to know, we only look at kids who were in Denver before the reforms began for at least 2 years, and then who were then there after. So there's no way that something could be different about this population of students.
And that was the critique of your first study, which was, like, from a descriptive standpoint, it told an important story, but you couldn't say, because it wasn't at that student level. So you came back, and what you're talking about now is you're able to actually track the students, so you can make sure these are actually students who were there, not just on average.
And that's important. That's important because another, again, sort of interesting fact about Denver is that it added 20,000 new students from when these reforms first began all the way till 2019. I mean, that's almost unheard of, right, for a large urban district that had a graduation rate of 39% and was among the lowest performing in the state. And so that in itself is a fascinating question. Like, that's part of what led us to looking at this. But yes, our first study included all of the students that entered into DPS and was at the school level, and so did not allow us to separate improvements that may have come from better performing students or students with more opportunities coming into the district later. Now, it's important to note too that that's actually still a positive outcome of the reforms, right? In many ways, that was actually one of the points of the reform was to bring people into the district. But it is almost certainly the case that population that came in later did have advantages, perhaps that students who were in the district before the reforms began really did. And so another fascinating example of this, and again, another indicator of success of these reforms, is that during the reform period, the percentage of students enrolled in private school in Denver was cut in half. And so from 15% to 7-8%. It's gone up now since the pandemic some, and as the reforms have have been changed. But that in itself means that there are students in Denver today who would never be there otherwise. So anyway, so that's we
let's
do
talk
the
real quickly
second.
about getting that data. So, because I think this is an important part of the story that sort of, I suspect the average person who doesn't work in our sector is just watching or listening to this and is like, well, of course you'd want to evaluate this stuff, but actually getting access to that student level data so you could come back and do the more fine-grained analysis, that was a whole fight, and you ran into sort of nonstop resistance on that. So talk a little bit about that. Like that's just a very illustrative thing about the politics of this sector.
Sure. So I think, first of all, it's just important to remember that, 2015, we had this whole backlash against standardized testing, opt out, etc. And in Colorado, that the sort of anti-testing movement has always actually been bipartisan. There are people on the right who want to get rid of testing and who don't like, data collection. And there are people on the left who for different reasons don't like testing and data collection. And yet that's those two sort of sides kind of coalesced during that period to make it what kind of almost known within Colorado that it's hard to get access to student level data. So I think in some ways my experience with the politics of education reform before I became a researcher helped me sort of to see that landscape before I began the research. And so I definitely approached this research knowing that it was going to be difficult to get the data needed. Interestingly, it might be interesting for your listeners, I did not intend to do two studies. It took me almost 4 years to get the actual student level data. And the reason why I released the first study is because we were doing the study. The goal was to do this entire study, this comprehensive study that would look at both the system level indicators and student level indicators. But as we were proceeding, we were running into opposition. And so first, the district itself refused to work with us or acknowledge the research, and then
are they doing a different evaluation? Like, do they have like because you would think, given all the conversations in the sector about continuous learning and transparency, they'd be excited to have high quality evaluation happening to learn from. So was there? I'm trying.
Yeah,
I'm trying to give them their due and steelman their what seems a tricky position that they took. Like, is there any reason for it other than they didn't want, because they had been elected on a platform that this was terrible, and you were coming in to see, is it in fact terrible?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's just very difficult to separate the district's response from the change in leadership at the school board and superintendent level. And so, if anything, I think the leadership of Denver Public Schools during the reform period welcomed this kind of scrutiny, frankly, because it was confident that what it was doing would uphold, would be able to sustain that kind of scrutiny. I think what's interesting is that I think that people at both extremes of the education reform debate have an interest in preventing nuanced understanding of these issues, and so I think there's like a combination of factors where the district was able to just say we aren't interested in exploring this. We're going in a different direction. I think also it's important to remember at the time that the political rhetoric was so comprehensive and so longstanding that lots of people actually believed that the reforms had been harmful, and I think still do believe. And so, to one extent, the district just may have not thought it was worth looking at. I think, again, it's important to recognize, even in a local control state, that ultimately, though, the authority over this data does come from the State Board of Education. And so, interestingly, the State Board of Education has members that are elected by congressional district. And so that also was an interesting process where I needed to try to convince a majority of the members, at the time it was 9, to vote in favor of releasing this data. And so that process, even after getting rejected by the district, took another year or so until I was able to finally access the data. I mean, I will share with you just a little bit of inside baseball, but I was trying to get the state board to acknowledge my request, because that meant that they would then need to place the item on the agenda and actually have a public meeting about it and potentially a vote. But they internally, they were basically slow walking the whole thing. And so finally, I threatened to show up at public comment and to basically make my request in public. And I was told that wouldn't be necessary and that it would be on the next board meeting's agenda. And so I did go, and you can watch on YouTube. They grilled me for 2 hours in a public meeting, and there was a vote, which I won by 1 vote of 5-4. Fortunately, two moderate Democrats joined with the 3 Republicans in favor of this research, and the 4 Democratic members who have been most vocal about their opposition to education reform broadly in charter schools. And I'm going to
ask you to speculate on something, Parker, that you may not be able to, but what would you estimate the percentage of the people who are fighting against you on this? What percentage have a sign on their front lawn about how much they love science?
Yeah, I won't speculate. I won't speculate on that, but I will just say that part of the challenge of even talking about this is that it sounds so unbelievable.
No, I tried to tell people this, and they were like, they assumed you had to be embellishing for effect, that like you had this like struggle to get the data.
Yes.
It's just like
in honor of Bobby Weir, Grateful Dead. One of my favorite lines is, if you knew all about what went down, it would burn off both your ears.
Oh, I thought you were going to go with the black-throated wind line. You ain't going to learn what you don't want to know.
Hey, now we know why Andy and I are soul brothers. But yeah, I really, I mean, it is. I mean, this is happening in almost every area of our political life right now, where it feels like to talk about reality is to sound like a crazy person. And so, yeah, I think it is really, it's really unfortunate that that this played, or this got to this level. I guess I would just say
where
it
was the
really
media in all this? Oh, sorry, Parker. I'm just like, also, where was the media? Because this seems like a classic David and Goliath story that they would like. The media generally wants stuff to be out in public and so forth. That's their project. So, like, where were they on all this? We can talk about it. I was stunned by the deafening silence when the second study came out. But where were they when you were fighting to try to get this released? Were they just not aware of it because you were trying to do it discreetly behind the scenes?
I think that's that's the main reason that they were not aware of it for most of the 2 years, was that I really was trying not to play politics. And one of my strategies in the face of extreme politics is to not play along. And what I mean by that is that I made my request where I work. I'm on the faculty of a state university school of public affairs. I have institutional review board approval. I did it all in a very straightforward way and did not try to pull strings or lobby or anything like that, because I wanted it to stand on its own, because I knew that it actually was deserving of approval, irrespective of any lobbying that or strings I could pull. And I think ultimately that was helpful, because once I did decide to contact the media, which was right around the time I was preparing to go and give public comment, I alerted them. And I want to give a shout out to Erica Meltzer, who was at the time, or just transitioning at the time from her role as bureau chief for Chalkbeat, Colorado, to her role today as bureau chief of Chalkbeat nationally. She believed me, and then did her due diligence and discovered that what I was telling her was correct, and the answers she was getting from people about why were not satisfying to her. And so she actually wrote a series of articles that encourage anyone to dig into, because they really do tell this.
We'll put those in the show notes.
Yeah.
But then when the study came out, though, I was struck how little national attention there was, and there was plenty of national attention to the fight over the school board and all that. So how little national attention there was to the results, and even in Colorado, relatively, and honestly in the education community, even the reform community, like there was like the silence was kind of deafening. Was that your experience?
Yes, it's hard, because honestly, academics are not very used to having their research get publicized anyway. So I want to be sure to note that, in and of itself, it's strange to get a lot of attention. But I think, yes, in terms of the stakes at play, right, how high the stakes are here, and in light of the really intense politics and very explicit rhetoric around these reforms, I do think it's somewhat strange that there has not been more coverage of these improvements. And I guess I would just point your listeners, and I imagine that many of you already have seen the article by Ravi Gupta about New Orleans and the reforms there. And this, I think it's the inconvenient truth of reform in New Orleans. But I think it's essentially the same story. You can read that, and it's essentially the same story. And what I mean by that is that I think both New Orleans and Denver, in different ways and to different extents and in different contexts, represent something that is truly threatening to both wings of the education policy debate in America. They are truly threatening to the defenders of the existing system, because they really do provide a different alternative model that rigorous empirical evidence indicates can be more effective than the traditional model. But then also because for those on the right who are, I think, more interested and more willing to basically blow up existing systems, the idea that you could in fact create such dramatic improvement without doing that, both systems are radically different than the traditional one, but they are still within the paradigm of public education. And I think for people who are concerned with abandoning the paradigm of public education writ large, I think it's very threatening. I think another important thing to think about is the extent to which traditional school systems are really one of the last remaining entitlements for the middle class and even the upper middle class. They are this thing that operates in ways to provide privileged opportunities to people with privilege, and so I do think that there is almost like a cultural aversion to challenging the one best system or traditional unitary model in a way that would really cause sort of massive consequences all across society.
And the politics on that are pretty through the looking glass, which I think is hard for people to get their heads around.
I have to say, though, I'm not, having grown so cynical, I'm not at all surprised by the response of other parties. This is what I would have expected. The thing that I just can't understand is the response of the ed reform world ourselves, and especially of charter school people too. We have this last election, and the press coverage afterwards talks about charter school advocates really saying the same thing that the teacher union advocates were talking about. And it's like, we ourselves can't claim that this has been historic progress. We ourselves can't tell the Denver story. It's like we shy away from it. I think we shy away from New Orleans too. The first thing we say as ed reformers in urban context is, oh, we would never want to get to New Orleans. Don't get me wrong. We're not talking about New Orleans. Oh my God, not New Orleans. When really there's nothing to be ashamed of about the progress that's been made in New Orleans over the last 20 years. All sorts of problems, all sorts of mistakes, like we made mistakes in Denver too, of course. But Parker, what's your reaction to that? I mean, how do you think the ed reform world ourselves are responding to this? And are we telling the story as we should be?
Yeah, so this is a complicated question and with a complicated answer, but I'll try not to go off in lots of different directions and try to stay focused. But it's important to recognize that the reaction of reformers to both New Orleans and Denver can't be disconnected from the larger campaign of opposition that has been in place for over a decade now. And so I think, especially when we consider just the comprehensive nature of the existing system and how truly dominant it is, even still today, 30 years after when we first began introducing these alternative delivery mechanisms, it is still, I think, true that many people have an almost instinctual sort of sympathy for the traditional system. And so I think the more that people heard that messaging, the harder it was for them to feel brave enough to even challenge it. And these things are complicated, right? And so in some places, some of these claims are true. In other places, they're not. I guess one thing I think is important, so I'm going to try to say this as concisely as possible, but I think that within the reform movement, there have always been these multiple wings of reform. And so I think that certainly Denver is representative of a particular wing, but there also have been others who have supported the reforms, but not necessarily for the reasons that the people who led the reforms in Denver and in New Orleans might have for themselves. And so what I mean by that is that I think, there is still a big contingent of people who consider themselves education reformers who are primarily about improving the existing system. They're the Marshall Tuckers of, the basically trying to double down on the core model. And I think one of the things that's interesting about Denver is that it combined these people who were really trying to improve the traditional system without necessarily changing it all that much, and then other people who actually were it really saw an opportunity to completely reinvent everything. And so I think that part of what happened in Denver was that you have people who, as charters and innovation schools continue to grow, and as that generates more and more backlash from the traditional system, including from teachers, the people who maybe were not necessarily on board with the theory of change that created the reforms, but they were supportive of them in general, started to get uncomfortable with them in a way that made them, unwilling even to defend them, even in the face of success. And so I do think, that is definitely partly responsible for this. I also think another aspect of this is that context is so different everywhere. There's so much variation across the country in the way that these things work, that there are lots of features in Denver that I don't think people ever really fully understood or even were willing to believe were true. And that then, on that combined with the nationalization of the political debate around these reforms meant that it became really difficult to hold on to the differences and to sort of live in that nuance, live in the question. It's like I like to tell my students, but that I think that the more and certainly as polarization, things get more and more polarized, the center actually shrinks. And the space for that kind of nuanced reform goes away.
You said an interesting thing there that we don't need to double click on it, but just you've got people who kind of want to. There's almost like three camps now. You got people who want to double down on the existing system. You got people who want to double down on the existing principles, but are open to new ways for delivery and so forth. And then you got some people who neither of those things is very interesting to them. They're pushing off in new, very different and sort of radical directions. And they're sort of like, and maybe it's part of the reasons where it's sort of a stasis around reform is neither of those camps are entirely strong enough to sort of carry the day.
Yeah. Yes, I think that's right. And that the attempt to do these reforms in a way that was not like explicitly adversarial to the district itself did, I think, cause this, create a dynamic where people may have been unwilling to do things that in other places, in other contexts, they would absolutely have done. So just to give you an example, I mentioned there are 50 charter schools in Denver. Half of them are in district facilities. And so, it's just a very it's a fundamental thing that then arguably compromises charters, right? In the sense that maybe then they aren't as autonomous and willing to sort of be themselves, et cetera. We can talk about that, but it's not clear that we would have 50 charter schools in Denver if the district hadn't offered half of them space in its own facilities. And so we have to be real about the politics of the possible, right? And that what it takes to actually make progress here is I think is probably some level of compromise between these sort of idealistic visions of what we think should happen and what is actually possible on the ground.
I'm glad that you believe that there are some idealistic visions that are out there. I'm not aware of any. You know,
Well,
and
well, let me give you one. I mean, let me just say it as an example. Like the idea that we're going to just like suddenly flip a switch and we could make all schools charter schools is I think like some people's vision, and yet not, I think, a realistic vision for the immediate future, or one that, you know, likely. And so the reason for that, again, I mean, I'm not like, part of this is my own learning through this, where it is just remarkable how durable the existing traditional model really is. And so, you know, as we all know, there are lots of places where charters are really operating at the margins of the system. And I am, you know, one of the lessons I learned from Paul Hill, and also, I guess, from Ted Koldery, is just the importance of recognizing that charters are an institutional innovation, and that what they're really about is providing an alternative model for fulfilling the public and private purposes of education in a free society. And so, you know, from my point of view, that like, if we're serious about that, then that means trying to recognize the extent to which autonomy at the school level, choice among schools, accountability for performance are all things that are actually require public action, and that probably can't be done solely through the private sphere. And so I think that, you know, I don't want to like try to characterize anyone in any kind of like, you know, generalistic sense or whatever, but it's more, I'm just trying for us to say, you know, to recognize that likely the answer is going to be different in different contexts everywhere, and that there are like different stages of this work, that actually we are at different, like there are different places that are at different stages. And so I think we need to be much more thoughtful about what that means, and like what it would look like to have a sort of unified theory of change amidst the reality of that kind of diversity of experience. So I don't know if that.
well, I could go on for another half hour here. But I have at least another question or two here. I appreciate Parker you spending this time with us. And I love the nuance. This conversation is great. I will also say, I mean, I think there's just some broad swaths that are true here. One is that the backlash has just been scary, and it's making some people lack the courage to go through it. And the experience in Indianapolis right now and what people are living through there, I think speaks to that. If you name the unnameable, this is what happens to you. Second thing is, I don't know if it's our natural impulses or if we're being coached into a point of saying, don't say anything negative about the traditional system. The on the margin voters don't like it, so give up your critique. And without any critique, then we don't have any fuel to keep going forward. But the thing I think more than anything else is, in places where we get to 30, 40, 50% of kids in charter schools, we run out of ideas. We run out of gas. It's happening all over the place. And the thing that's just interesting about New Orleans is I don't think that the storm was the anomaly. The anomaly was the vision and an idea for finishing the job. And the way we finish the job is not the way we start the job. You've got to bring all sorts of schools into innovation status or something like that. In New Orleans, they were unapologetic about it. They are going to become charter schools. That's fine. In other places, we might want to call them different things: mayoral academies, innovation schools, Renaissance schools. I don't care what they are. They are finishing the evolution of the system toward an end state consistent with what we started in the first place. And our inability to say what that thing is and to call it a noble thing to aspire to is, in my mind, the central failure that's holding us back right now.
So let me respond to some of this in a couple different ways, because I think this is a really important issue that I certainly think about maybe all the time. But so I think first of all, part of what we talked earlier about what I find so interesting about Denver, and one of the things I find so interesting about Denver is precisely this point: is that the reforms were built around the idea that the traditional model was failing and was destined to fail into the future. And not only was it ineffective and inefficient, it was unjust. And I think we have somehow lost the ability to claim this injustice and to name it and to stand for the idea that we can and must do better as a free society. And so I think this is really one of the things that is definitely most fascinating for me is how much pressure there has been to abandon that kind of that way of talking about this, because it really does mean that actually today, even at systems in most places actually still have almost all of the pathologies that led to the creation of this reform movement in the first place. And so it's something that, again, is another reason why it's very, very important to recognize the elements of Denver's reforms that are not about charters, not about innovation schools. They're actually about making the traditional system function more equitably for everyone. And so, we've talked a lot about charters, and I know, that's innovation schools are an example, but or another example, but things like forced teacher placement, right? That was one of Tom Boasberg's. I'll never forget. I witnessed how angry it made him when he learned that the only schools that were receiving forced place teachers were the schools serving the most vulnerable students. And so people need to know that Tom Boasberg, made a change in 2010, said, and after a state law that helped passed by Mike Johnson, now mayor, but at the state and district level, they were working to fundamentally change these elements of the traditional model, which are demonstrably inequitable, and that's a great example where people may not know, but the Colorado Education Association, the statewide teachers union, and the Denver Teachers Union spent a decade suing in court to block the provision that ended forced placements. And I think that's just, if we could talk politics for a second, it's really important to think about, when were they doing that? Why did they sue instead of fight publicly? And I'm almost sure that it's because Obama was in the White House, reform was bipartisan, the idea that we weren't going to address things like last in, first out, or forced placement of teachers, or inequitable internal district funding allocations, right? Those were not going to probably, at least at that time, sell well with the public. So they went to court and they lost repeatedly and finally lost at the Supreme Court. But those are still issues that people fighting about today in Colorado. And you need to sort of understand charter politics and choice politics in connection to those politics also, that we're actually still fighting to defend the existing system tooth and nail, even in places where there has been massive change for the better.
So lightning round question for you. How much of this overlay, a lot of people are watching. So Michael Bennett, he worked for the former mayor, became the superintendent, was appointed to the Senate, has won re-election multiple times since then. But he's now, his term is end for a few more years in the Senate, but he's running for governor. And he's running against the state's attorney general, and the big flashpoint seems to be like, how much are we Democrats about building for the future versus how much to just like fight Trump now? Like, is there an education overlay to that primary? So sorry, I said lightning round, then I asked you a long question, but is there an education overlay to that primary education reform overlay related to some of the stuff we've been talking about? Number one, and number two, do you have any predictions on how that primary is going to go?
I definitely do think there is some overlay in the upcoming primary for the governor in Colorado. I think really, and this is again in some ways why it's so interesting, is that Denver, in many ways, is this microcosm of the larger national challenges around these issues. And so, Democrats are debating whether Democrats should moderate or whether they should, double down on and move left. And I think that in some ways, like, that actually is a question in this upcoming election, is whether there is actually still a vital center, whether there is still a place where people can agree that we may not be able to agree about whether to keep the system exactly as it is or whether to blow it up entirely, but at least we can agree that we should be doing things that make progress. And there's lots of evidence that Colorado has had lots of progress with not just in Denver, but across the state through many of the reform strategies that have now become so unpopular among a certain set. That's one point I would just make though about this, is that I do think it's a mistake to think that reform is unpopular in Denver because of the flipping back and forth. First of all, part of what makes Denver so interesting is that reformers held almost unanimous control for almost a decade. 5 board elections, 4 bond elections. So that is, the change is actually post 2019. And I think, if anything, what we're seeing is the incoherence of trying to undo reforms which have created better outcomes and more equitable access. And so it's that I hope that the debate doesn't devolve into like these national level talking points, because I think actually what's most exciting about Colorado is that we can be a place where people actually focus on what's real and what's in front of them, and are practical and pragmatic about what's possible, and so I'm hopeful there. I do think it will come down to whether Democrats in the state and other moderates, we have lots of independents, whether they will be able to come together and sort of stand up for improvement, even if that improvement requires challenging the status quo.
Love it on the macro. My last
you got away with that to predict. Do you have a prediction, or is it just hard to tell yet?
Oh, I think it's very hard to tell. I think definitely Michael Bennet has a lot of support. Bill Weiser has lots of support too, but there's actually lots of overlap there, and so that's where it gets, perhaps will get interesting. But I think, I think I do. Just if we could just make sure to talk about what concerns me about the future more broadly of this work, and about some of the sort of immediate points in terms of the need for leadership. I think
this is your moment to do that, because I think Jed was about to bring us in for a landing, so you get this.
It was really in this.
This is fantastic. As you lawyers say, this is your closing statement.
Yeah, but it give us the future, in Denver specifically too. Optimism, pessimism, and it seemed like you were going there naturally anyway, Pat Parker.
Yeah. So I think it is, tempting to look at Denver and sort of say, oh, reform has failed, and look, we had to do something else. And I think that is a mistake. because it underestimates the extent to which the reforms have really changed the allocation of power and control in the city, and I think also underestimates the extent to which the system has been changed in ways that make it demonstrably more effective and more equitable, that are going to be hard to undo. On top of that, remember, we have 30,000 students out of 80,000 that are in autonomous public schools in Denver still. And if anything, I think one example of this is that even though all of this stuff is still so controversial, the school board, the new school board, which is now controlled entirely by candidates that were supported by the teachers union, and they have been very vocal about their opposition to reforms, they're likely to approve next week unanimously the renewal of 5 charter schools, and just are also likely to renew Denver's 1 innovation zone with 7 innovation schools. And so, it's just important to sort of not, like, yeah, sometimes we can get distracted by sort of other things that are maybe more sexy or more exciting, but actually the sort of long-term sustainability work is, I think, the kind of work that is what will actually get us to scale in a more broad way. And so I really respect and admire the work that Brandon Brown is doing in Mind Trust in Indianapolis, because it's so representative for me of exactly what we've been talking about this whole conversation, where as that system has fragmented over time, the new operators who actually care about public education as a goal and not a particular set of institutions, right? Big lesson from Paul Hill. But the people that are in that city that are there to provide public education and that have that as their goal, they recognize that something has to change in the future if they are going to sort of go to the next level. And I think, again, that Denver has lots of those elements already in place. And it's rather than sort of trying to, which is better, which is worse, like, for me, both of them need to be held up as examples, because this kind of work is going to be different, because we have 50 different states with vastly different educational governance models, et cetera. And so, I am very hopeful that these examples will actually become the foundation for a new vision of the future. One thing I just got to say about some of your focus on the North Star, the need for a North Star and the charter movement. I mean, I think one thing I'm concerned about is that I do think there is a tension between the growth goal there on the North Star and the goal to the question to what's next, all kids, and the other what is the others on the star. Remind me of your. Sorry, I'm blanking on your. But basically, that there's a tension between public, that I apologize, but this tension between the growth of these alternatives and then the desire to hold strong to the idea that we're not actually trying to do something other than public education. We are actually trying to provide education at the public expense in the most equitable and effective way we possibly can. And for me, that's in tension with growth, especially because we know that these sectors are so different across the country, that I think it's possible that some growth in some places actually doesn't move us towards the question two, and doesn't provide a new vision for what public might mean. So I don't know if you want to respond to that or if we have time, but I want to think about, like, whether the political pressure to maintain coherence within the movement might limit our ability to actually message what we're trying to do more clearly to the public.
Well, we could definitely go down this for quite a while in terms of landing this plane. I will just say that I did choose the 5 points of a star for the charter school world very intentionally, and I don't think that you can make it work with 4. And what you're basically saying is, hey, if you pull out, the part of QE, the question 2 part that results in all schools getting better and all schools getting fairer, then it falls apart on us. And I think it's really great to have people like you pushing on us and saying, hey, you got to make sure that this all wraps together into a comprehensive vision for the future. So, but I also just think what you've shared today, Parker, along so many lines is just so helpful. It's just so helpful. I've learned a ton from this. And I'm looking forward to our beer and coffee time as I come and visit my folks in the months ahead. But just thank you for this. Thank you for your work. I can't wait. I know you're working on a big book. I can't wait to see that. Just really appreciate everything you've shared today.
Yeah, Parker,
thank you very much.
Just, yeah, fantastic. Yes, I think a lot here for people who listened, and not just a deep dive on Denver, where I agree with you, by the way. I don't think reform failed. I think reform politics failed, and we've talked about that before, and there's some reasons for that. And so on that, but also then just the more larger implications of it and what it means. So thank you just so much for your time.
Let me close on one point real quickly that I hope will resonate with your listeners, is that one of the most hopeful aspects of my work now that I'm teaching and researching is that I now have students who are in my graduate courses who went to schools in Denver that did not exist a decade ago. And that I'm hopeful because there are thousands, tens of thousands of those students that are in coming out of better systems like Denver and in New Orleans and in Houston and all over the country, that there really is a new generation of young people that I think are going to be unwilling to have their experience denied, and are going to challenge the idea that that there is only one way to provide public education, and that keeps me hopeful.
Love that.
Thanks,
all right.
Parker.
Thank you so much, Parker.
Thanks, Jed. Good to see you.
Yeah, you too.
You guys take care.